When facing e4, if black wants to imbalance the game and provoke white into unorthodox territory, then black may play an opening as tricky as it is for non-Russian speakers to pronounce, the Alekhine Defense, or commonly referred to in some circles as the Alekhine for ease of reference. This provocative opening makes its appearance with knight f6. Rather than first securing the center with e5 and then contemplating attacking white's center, the Alekhine attacks the e4 pawn, provoking an immediate imbalance, encouraging white to march forward with e5. White's options to challenge the Alekhine are quite limited, because defending the center with knight c3 not only allows a transposition into classical king-pawn territory with e5, the adventurous Alekhine player may prefer to strike in the center immediately with d5, provoking complications that are not unfavorable to black. The opening struggle begins after white takes more space and gains a tempo against black's knight with e5, when black centralizes the knight with knight d5, inviting white to gain another tempo while chasing the knight with c4, provoking the knight to retreat to the b6 square. This seemingly offside knight adds pressure against the pawn that just attacked it. White may decide to continue chasing black's knight with c5. Whenever you advance a pawn forward, you always have to consider the space left behind. In this case, continuing to chase black's knight does weaken the d5 square, so the knight may return to the centralized point with knight d5. White may once again attack this restless knight while actively developing the light-squared bishop with bishop c4. Although c6 is also an interesting option, black typically supports the knight with e6, revealing the dark-squared bishop's pressure against the c5 pawn. Black is not especially worried about bishop takes d5, surrendering the bishop pair while doubling black's pawns with e takes d5, as black is prepared to strike against white's center with d6, confronting white's pawns on the 5th rank. We'll take a look at what happens when white supports the advanced pawns with d4 in a moment, but it's worth noting that white can invite gambit play with knight c3, adding a second attacker against the knight, so black typically exchanges knights with knight takes c3. B takes c3, dreaming of a future d4, is well met by the timely d5, striking in the center with good play for black. White may decide to open the d-file as well as a path for the dark-squared bishop with d takes c3. Now that the d-file has been opened for white's queen, striking in the center with d5 is less effective, as white is happy to open up the position with en passant c takes d6. There is no pressure to immediately capture the c5 pawn. A strong alternative is knight c6, attacking the other unprotected white pawn on the 5th rank. If black immediately plays bishop takes c5, then white will seek compensation for the pawn with queen g4, attacking the newly unprotected g7 pawn. It's important to avoid castling, as white has the strong response bishop h6, taking advantage of the pinned g7 pawn. It is possible to play g6, although this does weaken important dark squares on the king side. Retreating the bishop to f8 is more playable than it looks, preparing to strike against white's queen with h5 on the next move. In addition to the committal king f8, the interested viewer can also explore queen e7, returning the pawn if white plays queen takes g7, preparing to simplify the position by offering an exchange of queens with queen f8, leading to original, interesting play. No matter how black decides to respond to queen g4, white's active position fairly claims compensation for the pawn and is definitely worth exploring. Knight c3 leads to interesting play, but a more stable attempt is to support the vulnerable pawns on the 5th rank with d4. White has an impressive looking space advantage, but black has two important ways to challenge white's center. d6 is a typical pawn break in the Alekhine, when after the common exchange c takes d6, in c takes d6, this transposes into a line from the Alekhine variation of the Sicilian defense. If black would prefer to keep the game in Alekhine territory, then another strong pawn break is b6, joining the dark-squared bishop in pressurizing the advanced c5 pawn. It's possible for white to immediately give up the bishop pair in order to compromise black's structure with bishop takes d5, and white may first decide to relieve the tension with c takes b6. Black's dark-squared bishop suddenly enjoys an open diagonal, and the rook on a8 is about to enjoy open lines on the a-file after a takes b6. If white continues with the natural developing move knight f3, then black is ready to exchange light-squared bishops with bishop a6, threatening to exchange white's best minor piece with a comfortable game. White can anticipate the light-squared bishop's pressure with knight e2, supporting the center while blocking the f1 to a6 diagonal, protecting the king and allowing kingside castling. The immediate d6 is a strong pawn break to consider, and black may also continue with the plan of offering an exchange of light-squared bishops with bishop a6. If white decides to exchange bishops, this invites knight takes a6, eyeing the b4 square, as well as preparing a potential pawn break with c5. Retreating the bishop with bishop b3 allows active options such as bishop b4 check and knight c6, adding serious pressure against white's position. A double-edged choice is to play bishop takes d5, e takes d5. White has surrendered the bishop pair, and the newly unopposed light-squared bishop applies annoying pressure against white's kingside. On the other hand, black does have double d-pawns, and white's e5 pawn still claims a central space advantage. With this in mind, black is prepared to resolve some of the structural issues with d6, preparing to undouble the pawns on the d-file. If white would like to discourage d6, an interesting attempt is knight b to c3. Attacking the d5 pawn, it's possible to reinforce the center with the reactionary c6, a somewhat passive, although playable option. If black would prefer to emphasize piece activity, then black can ignore white's pressure and simply play d6, inviting white to capture the pawn. Black enjoys strong compensation for the pawn after d takes e5, clearing the diagonal for the dark-squared bishop, as well as revealing the queen's attack against the d5 knight. White can respond by gaining a pawn and revealing the queen's protection of the knight with d takes e5. The e5 pawn is now a vulnerable target, so black can actively develop with knight c6, threatening the e5 pawn, preparing to meet the natural bishop f4, with knight b4, threatening to both capture the knight on d5, as well as eyeing the d3 square, forcing white to exchange knights with knight takes b4, allowing the dark-squared bishop to actively enter the game with bishop takes b4 check. The two bishops exert incredible pressure against white's kingside, so this unpleasant position is not worth the momentary gain of a pawn on e5. The chase variation with c5 is a committal option that leads to interesting play, although white must be careful not to get overextended. Rather than chasing the knight, a solid option is to simply grab more central space with d4, building an impressive center, so it's important for black to actively counterattack it with the thematic pawn break d6, threatening to open up the d-file with d takes e5, which would result in a favorable exchange of queens. White has two main ways to deal with this central challenge. The most aggressive, double-edged option is f4, an option we'll later examine. A more positional option is to exchange pawns with e takes d6, unsurprisingly known as the exchange variation, leaving black with an important decision to make. How exactly should black recapture? E takes d6 is the more symmetrical, solid option. We'll take a look at a sample line in a moment. The other choice is to imbalance the pawn structure with c takes d6. This is a more combative, but also riskier option. The d6 pawn allows the possible pawn break d5, or possibly support a future e5. Capturing with the c-pawn also grants white a queenside pawn majority. A promising line for white is to play knight c3, intending to stabilize the queenside prior to completing kingside development. Black's most active option is to play g6, intending to add pressure against white's center with bishop g7, so white can anticipate this with bishop e3, reinforcing the d4 pawn, which also prepares to meet bishop g7, allowing the strong response rook c1, supporting the c-file while vacating the long dark-squared diagonal. After black castles, white can secure the c4 pawn, often a sensitive spot in white's camp, with b3. This is a strong practical weapon for white, as black cannot easily generate the desired counterplay against white's solid center. Striking in the center with e5 allows d takes e5, intending to exchange queens on d8, followed by c5, leading to a promising position for white. The other central strike d5 allows c5, when black's knight on b6 does not have a good response, as retreating the knight to d7 simply loses the d5 pawn. Attacking white's center with knight c6 allows d5, when it's difficult for black to find a reasonable plan. Grandmaster Alexander Shabalov, a supporter of the Alekhine, has tried the radical f5, and Grandmaster Komsky has tried the more positionally minded bishop f5. These are all moves intending to imbalance the game the enthusiastic supporter of this variation may explore, but white seems to be doing quite well in all of these lines. C takes d6 can lead to interesting play, especially if white is unaware of the strong line we just introduced, but with proper play black appears to be under some pressure. A more solid approach is to respond with e takes d6, maintaining a symmetrical pawn structure. White does enjoy more space, and behind that space advantage the potential for more active pieces. That being said, careful play is still required by white, as a natural developing move such as knight f3 runs into bishop g4, pinning the knight to the queen, while preparing to assault the d4 pawn with knight c6, a more attractive target now that one of its key defenders is pinned. This is certainly not the end of the world for white, but allowing this pin creates unnecessary stress against white's center. Rather than playing knight f3, allowing the annoying pin bishop g4, a strong alternative is to develop the other knight with knight c3, supporting the center while remaining flexible on the king side. There are no shortage of interesting ideas to explore, but a popular setup for white is to play bishop d3, followed by developing the kingside knight to e2. Immediately challenging white's center with knight c6 is a provocative choice to explore, but black's most common choice is to play bishop e7. Unlike the more aggressive c takes d6 lines we examined earlier, black does not fianchetto the dark-squared bishop with g6 and bishop g7. In this case, the bishop will still find life on the long diagonal from the f6 square without accepting any immediate kingside weaknesses. Let's take a look at white's popular choice, bishop d3. Activating the light-squared bishop, preparing to meet black's reasonable plan of castling kingside. With knight g to e2. Developing the knight to the e2 square supports white's center while discouraging bishop g4, because if black decides to pin the knight. Not only can white play queen c2, unpinning the knight while attacking the h7 pawn, developing the knight to e2 allows the resource f3, gaining a tempo against the bishop and supporting white's center. It's worth noting that if black tries to take advantage of the exposed king with bishop h4 check, white can place both of black's bishops under attack with g3. Since the f3 pawn is now unprotected, black is relying upon the resource bishop takes f3, capturing a pawn while threatening the rook on h1. This allows white to build a serious lead in development by castling kingside, inviting sharp gambit play. But white also has another strong resource with the tactical shot bishop takes h7 check. If black refuses to take the bishop, then white is ready to castle with a strong initiative. White is prepared to meet king takes h7, with the double attack queen d3 check, regaining the bishop after king g8, queen takes f3. The semi-open f-file is a great resource for white's major pieces to add pressure against black's kingside, especially after white castles, building a strong queen-rook battery on the f-file. Notice that black's bishop has to spend another tempo retreating when white is ready to play b3, supporting the c4 pawn with a promising game. Rather than playing bishop g4, black can focus on confronting white's center with knight c6, building pressure against the d4 pawn. If white decides to lunge forward with d5, black is prepared to play knight b4, attacking the light-squared bishop, which is a key defender of the vulnerable c4 pawn. Instead of clarifying the central tension, white can simply complete kingside development by castling. Since white's light-squared bishop is both an active piece pointing toward black's kingside, as well as an important defender of the c4 pawn, it's tempting to play knight b4, preparing to gain the bishop pair, but white has the instructive response bishop b1. This powerful retreat preserves the light-squared bishop, but doesn't it leave the c4 pawn hanging? This turns out to be a clever trap, as white can play a3, gaining a tempo against the knight, so after it retreats to c6, now that the d3 square is no longer protected by the knight, white can win a piece with queen d3, threatening both checkmate on h7 as well as the unprotected knight on c4, so white is winning a piece. Since knight b4 is well met by bishop b1, black may continue with the theme of building pressure against white's center with bishop f6, adding a second attacker against the d4 pawn, if white decides to defend the pawn with the natural bishop e3. Now that the bishop is on e3, black may confidently jump forward with knight b4. Black is ready to collect the bishop pair because if white plays bishop b1, in this case black may capture the c4 pawn with confidence. The point is that if white plays a3, instead of retreating the knight to c6, black has the strong response knight takes e3, enjoying an excellent position as white no longer has the crushing queen d3 double attack trick available. The d4 pawn is under serious pressure, but white may calmly reinforce the c4 pawn with b3. White reinforces the c4 pawn, preparing to support d4 with bishop e3 on the next move. Notice that capturing twice on d4 does not win a pawn for black, as white has the discovered attack bishop takes h7 check, revealing the queen's pressure against the remaining piece on d4. Now that the c4 pawn is secure, knight b4 is not a serious threat, as white can simply play bishop b1. An interesting option for black is to take advantage of the open e-file with rook e8. White is prepared to support the center with bishop e3. At this point, black may be interested in exploring the idea of a5, claiming space on the queen side. A future pawn break a4 is now possible. a5 also reinforces the b4 square, so black may consider knight b4, attacking the light-squared bishop while clearing the c6 square for black's pawn, possibly preparing a future d5 pawn break. White may decide to respond to a5 by centralizing the queen with queen d2, leading to a tense middle game struggle. Now that the bishop is on e3, black has also tried bishop g4, pinning the knight to the queen, as f3 would leave the bishop on e3 hanging. Legendary grandmaster Vasily Ivanchuk dealt with this pressure by playing queen d2, stepping out of the pin, supporting the dark-squared bishop, as well as connecting the rooks on the first rank. Bishop h5 has been attempted, trying to exchange light-squared bishops with bishop g6, but the knight on e2 is well placed to respond with knight f4, preventing black's plan while preparing to collect the bishop pair. Ivanchuk's opponent, a then rising star known as Magnus Carlsen, tried to complicate the game by playing the thematic central strike d5. When Ivanchuk seized more space while attacking the knight on b6 with c5. The light-squared bishop remains quite awkward, so if black retreats the knight immediately, then white can play knight g3, preparing to harass the bishop with a future h3. With this in mind, Grandmaster Carlsen first inserted bishop takes e2, when white played the strong response bishop takes e2. The idea behind this move will be revealed in a moment, after black retreated the knight to the c8 square. Although this looks like a strange square, the knight is ready to enter the action once again from the e7 square, eyeing f5, adding pressure against the d4 pawn, as well as the bishop on e3. White centralized his rook with rook f to e1, anticipating black's plan to play knight 8 to e7. Dreaming of the active f5 square, Grandmaster Ivanchuk revealed the point behind capturing with the light-squared bishop, as he now played the powerful bishop g4, restricting black's knight from accessing the f5 square while activating the light-squared bishop. The d4 pawn remains well fortified, and white also claims the bishop pair advantage. White has achieved a comfortable position and went on to win the game. The exchange variation with e takes d6 is a reliable system for white, although as we noted, black has no shortage of interesting ideas to generate counter chances. White's most radical response to d6 is the ultra-aggressive four-pawns attack with f4. White commits to an all-or-nothing approach, maximizing the central space initiative, intending to roll black off the board. This is a double-edged decision, as white continues to only move pawns during the opening stage. Black intends to try and prove these pawns are overextended and vulnerable to counterattack. The truth lies somewhere in the middle, as white can certainly challenge black's defenses, but in so doing, black is allowed active counterplay leading to sharp, at times chaotic play. Against the four-pawns attack, black may investigate the radical pawn sacrifice g5, trying to break down white's massive center. But black's most reliable path is to exchange pawns with d takes e5. D takes e5 would allow black a favorable exchange of queens on d1, so white should recapture with the f-pawn. By exchanging the d-pawn, black's queen enjoys pressure against the d4 pawn, a key source of black's counterplay in the opening. A provocative, somewhat risky option is to play c5, encouraging d5, preparing to meet it with e6. This line is worth exploring, although white may gain the upper hand with a well-timed advance to d6. A more reliable option is to attack d4 while developing a piece with knight c6, adding a second attacker against d4. Notice that white cannot advance the pawn to d5, as this simply loses a pawn on e5. If white defends e5 with knight f3, intending to play d5, this is well met by bishop g4, pinning the knight to the queen. This means white's most popular choice is bishop e3, reinforcing the center while remaining flexible with the knight on g1. Black must always remain alert for the possibility of d5, but this is not currently a threat while the e5 pawn is hanging. This is a good moment for the light-squared bishop to enter the game with bishop f5, activating the light-squared bishop and creating the possibility of a future knight b4, trying to take advantage of white's weakened light squares. White continues to actively develop with knight c3, supporting the center as well as a future d5 advance. Notice the premature knight b4 is well met by rook c1, supporting the c2 square, when knight b4 is simply a loss of time. Now that the light-squared bishop has entered the action, black can support the center without blocking its development with e6, fighting for control over the d5 square. The immediate d5 is still a premature choice, not only because black can capture the unprotected e5 pawn, but the knight may also punish white's careless pawn advance with knight b4. This is a dream scenario for black against the four pawns attack. Knight c2 check is in the air, while white's advanced d5 pawn is attacked 4 times. White's center is simply overextended and about to collapse, the risk of pushing several pawns in the opening phase. Rather than the premature advanced d5, white may modestly develop with bishop e2, or simply play knight f3, supporting the center, possibly preparing straightforward development with bishop e2 and kingside castling. Since the bishop has already moved to the f5 square, spending another tempo on bishop g4 is not as effective. White can simply respond with bishop e2, leading to a pleasant game for white. We have reached an important crossroads. We're about to introduce some incredibly sharp play, so it's worth noting that black may also want to investigate bishop b4, pinning the c3 knight and discouraging d5, a lesser played but interesting alternative. That being said, black's most common reply is bishop e7. If the center remains stable, as is the case if white plays bishop e2, intending to castle kingside, then black is ready to castle followed by the thematic pawn break f6, as played by Grandmaster Nikita Vityagov. This is a reasonable path with mutual chances, but white may also test black's memory, as well as nerves, with the forcing d5. Provoking the exchange is e takes d5, c takes d5. White has established an impressive-looking advanced center, but this is a double-edged decision as these pawns must be constantly protected by pieces. Black's only move to stay afloat is knight b4, adding pressure against the d5 pawn, as well as threatening a fork on c2. It looks like white's center may be overextended, but things are not so simple as white has the strong reply knight d4, centralizing the knight, protecting the c2 square, as well as attacking the bishop on f5. Since bishop g6 allows the annoying bishop b5 check, Grandmaster Peter Svidler played bishop d7. Supporting the advanced center with queen f3 is an interesting option to explore, but his opponent, Grandmaster Alexander Grischuk, preferred the more forcing option e6. Provoking the exchange is f takes e6, and d takes e6. White's e6 pawn harasses the light-squared bishop, so Grandmaster Svidler played bishop c6. Exerting pressure down the long diagonal, Grandmaster Grischuk threw caution to the wind with the aggressive queen g4, attacking the g7 pawn and preparing to hunt down the enemy king. Grandmaster Svidler embraced the chaos with bishop h4 check. This leads to razor-sharp play in which both sides must play with tremendous accuracy, as a single slip can spell disaster. Grandmaster Svidler managed to successfully navigate the incredible complications and went on to win this instructive game. Immediately challenging the knight to c4 leads to dynamic positions we just explored, but it's also worth noting that white's most popular choice is to first play d4, gaining more central space while supporting the e5 pawn. Although black may experiment with knight b6, the most common choice is to strike in the center with the familiar pawn break d6. White may continue with c4, leading to the exchange variation, or possibly the chaotic four pawns attack. On the other hand, white may prefer to enter the popular modern variation with knight f3. This modest developing move acknowledges the Alekhine's right to exist, and rather than trying to refute black's opening play, white supports the center with natural development, maintaining flexibility with the exchange e takes d6, as well as the option to chase black's knight with c4. The modern variation is a popular way to positionally challenge the Alekhine, and black has no shortage of options to explore. Bishop g4 is a natural idea, although since white is not fully committed to expanding in the center just yet, allowing black to add serious pressure against the d4 pawn. Bishop e2, unpinning the knight, is a safe and solid choice for white. g6 is another option to consider, preparing to fianchetto the dark-squared bishop. But in this video we are going to introduce the Larsen variation with d takes e5. Named after Danish grandmaster Bent Larsen, this reveals another point behind developing the knight to f3. White can centralize the knight with knight takes e5. White's active knight adds pressure against the sensitive f7 pawn, so black would love to exchange this piece. In a famous encounter, Grandmaster Larsen played the immediate knight d7, preparing to exchange knights. Former world champion Mikhail Tal, known for his ingenious attacking play, was understandably tempted to sacrifice the knight on f7. He ultimately decided to avoid this choice, playing bishop c4 instead, eventually leading to a draw. With the aid of modern engines, we now know that knight d7 is a bad move, and that white is fully justified in sacrificing a piece with knight takes f7, exposing the king after king takes f7, with the double attack queen h5 check, forking the king and unprotected knight on d5. Returning the piece allows white an overwhelming advantage, so the king reluctantly marches forward with king e6. White has several tempting options. One powerful choice is c4, attacking the vulnerable knight when black's exposed king is in serious trouble. Knight d7 is a good idea, but it's currently not a good move. In order to avoid the tactical bomb knight takes f7, black should support the knight on d5 with c6. Now that the knight on d5 is supported, black may consider playing knight d7. If white tries to dislodge the knight with c4, this is actually not a good choice for white, as it allows knight b4. Bishop f5 is one annoying threat, taking advantage of white's weakened light squares, and if white tries to chase the knight once again with a3, white is in for a rude awakening after the tactical shot queen takes d4, winning a pawn, as a takes b4 allows queen takes e5 check, and if white decides to capture the queen, this allows the unpleasant fork knight c2 check, regaining material on the next move with knight takes d4 when black is simply up a pawn, a good tactical trick to keep in mind. Since the knight on d5 is reinforced by the c6 pawn, bishop c4 isn't a particularly effective choice. Moving the bishop to d3 looks active, but it does block the queen's protection of the d4 pawn. In this case, black may be encouraged to play g6, preparing to fianchetto the dark-squared bishop, exerting pressure down the long diagonal. This is why white's most popular choice is to play the modest-looking bishop e2, preparing to simply castle and focus on rapid development. Although it's possible to play knight d7 immediately, white can avoid the exchange of knights with knight f3, when black's light-squared bishop remains passive. With this in mind, black can first play bishop f5, activating the light-squared bishop, and only then preparing to challenge white's knight with knight d7. We see a typical position arise after white castles, and black confronts white's active knight with knight d7. Since white enjoys a comfortable space advantage, it's better to avoid exchanging pieces with knight f3. A sensible continuation is e6, supporting the center while also preparing kingside development. White's play up to this point has been quite modest, simply focusing on healthy development. In order to challenge black's defenses, it's important to take space with c4, gaining a tempo against the knight in the process. If black tries to lunge forward with knight b4, threatening knight c2, the interested viewer is encouraged to analyze the powerful response a3, calling black's bluff, as knight c2 is well met by rook a2, leading to an overwhelming advantage for white. A more solid path is to simply retreat the knight back to f6. Grandmaster Sergei Karyakin demonstrated a path to a comfortable game for white, starting with knight c3. White's idea is to eventually gain the bishop pair with knight h4. If black tries to stop this with h6, providing an escape square for the light-squared bishop on h7, white is ready to strike in the center with d5, opening up lines in order to exploit his lead in development. His opponent, Grandmaster Alekhine, decided to activate his dark-squared bishop with bishop d6, pointing toward white's kingside while also preparing a future e5 pawn break. White continued with the well-timed knight h4, threatening the light-squared bishop, so black responded with bishop g6. There is no rush to claim the bishop pair with knight takes g6, as this would open up the h-file after h takes g6, revealing the rook's pressure against white's kingside. Grandmaster Alekhine preferred to play the instructive g3, supporting the knight on h4, restricting black's dark-squared bishop, and most importantly, preparing bishop f3, activating the light-squared bishop on the long diagonal, while also preparing a possible retreat to g2 if desirable. White is waiting for black to castle kingside before claiming the bishop pair with knight takes g6. Grandmaster Alekhine decided he did not have a better choice, and simply decided to castle, allowing knight takes g6, and h takes g6. White gains the bishop pair, followed by activating the light-squared bishop with bishop f3. White will likely continue with bishop e3, preparing to expand on the queen side with an eventual a3 and b4, and likely meeting a possible e5 pawn break with d5. Although white enjoys a slightly more comfortable game, black's position remains quite solid. One idea is to play rook e8 and queen c7, preparing the central pawn break e5. In this case, if white plays the desirable d5, this may be met by e4, trying to restrict white's light-squared bishop, leading to complex positional play. Instead of classically defending the center with a pawn, the Alekhine defense confronts white's center immediately with knight f6. The point behind this strange-looking move is to provoke white into marching forward with pawns, gaining space, but black intends to counterattack white's advanced center. White may try to challenge black's defenses with the aggressive four-pawns attack, leading to sharp, double-edged play. On the other hand, white may play more positionally, content with building a solid setup and trying to squeeze black from a slightly more comfortable position. No matter how white decides to handle the opening, the Alekhine remains a resilient, playable defense with plenty of creative resources to discover. Thanks for exploring this provocative defense against e4, and best of luck the next time black's knight makes a provocative entrance into your game on the very first move.